All right, well, hi everybody. Welcome. I'm really glad you could join us for this webinar with Deborah Bell. We're going to get started in just a second here. We have several AIM parents and AIM families. Also, quite a few of the AIM faculty and staff are joining us. Some of them are teaching right now and they would really like to be here, but as many of them who can come are here. And then we have several of our Facebook friends and those of you who found out from the email. So thanks for making time in your day. I know I'm really looking forward to this. You can let us know in the chat box just kind of how you heard about the webinar, and then Deborah, if you want to take it from there.
Great, thanks, Kate. For those of you who don't know, Catherine is my daughter, my oldest daughter, and she was homeschooled K through 12 just like her siblings, and now she is the administrator for AIM Academy, our online academy, and she's also an SAT math prep teacher. I wanted to do this webinar primarily for our AIM teachers, faculty, and our parents. I did homeschool my kids. I'm assuming that many people are familiar, have heard about something about me somewhere along the line. I went back to school after I finished homeschooling, and I got my PhD in educational psychology. I've always been fascinated by how kids learn. I come from a long line of educators. I sort of went off the reservation when I homeschooled my kids. But everybody's been a good sport about it, and going back to school was very validating for me. I think a lot of what you homeschool parents do naturally, the research supports as being the best way for kids to learn. So I think some of the information I might share with you this afternoon is going to be things you're already doing but maybe didn't realize they were actually beneficial for your kids. So let me get started here. There's a lot of things that I could tell you from the science of learning, and I've chosen 7 really important findings that I think you will find most helpful. So let's get underway here. And these 7 insights apply to both children and teenagers, though maybe when we finish, you might have some specific questions for me about the adolescent years, because there's a lot going on cognitively then that does also affect students' learning. So, first up, I think it's important to know that your kids' brains benefit from a rigorous workout. So challenge is good, effort is good. For even though the brain is an organ, it functions like a muscle. And I think if you think about the heart as an organ that also benefits from a rigorous workout, you have a good analogy to think about. So our brains are hardwired to learn. It's what causes development and cognitive growth, learning, processing new information, and having to struggle with that new information is all a part of how we can help our kids develop and learn well. So when your kids run into something difficult or challenging in homeschooling or in any one of our classes, it necessarily doesn't mean it's a bad thing. So think about how you benefit from aerobic exercise, from a good workout. We want to find a optimal workout for ourselves, and it's the same with our kids in terms of academic rigor. We don't want them to be over challenged so that they strain themselves or they pull a muscle or they are frustrated and are discouraged by the fact that what we're asking them to do is too difficult. Conversely, we also don't want them to be under challenged, become quickly bored. So we're looking for optimal rigor. I think some of the best teaching strategies that we can use when working with kids is to look to the world of sports. I think sports have figured out how to motivate kids and how to develop optimal athletes in this country. So there's a lot that coaches do. There's a lot that they do in practice time, and then the fact that kids get to play a real game that they care about, and that they are rewarded immediately for their efforts, and that they know how to score and they know how to win the game. All of those are good analogies for what we should be doing as teachers. So think like a coach. Am I giving my kids an appropriate amount of exercise? Am I giving them an appropriate amount of practice? Am I giving them the opportunities to test their skills, to use these skills that they're learning in a meaningful way? And am I making sure that I'm always aware of where they're at in the developmental process, so that I'm always adjusting the level of rigor for my kids to keep them engaged and interested. It's also good to have periods of rest. All right, I want to put this out there too. Our brains at rest, or not always being engaged in something that is rigorous, is equally important. In fact, sleep is honestly critical to academic development, to cognitive development and understanding. While we're sleeping, our brain processes information that we took in during the day. And this is when the brain solidifies some of what we have experienced during the day. So sleep is really important for our children. It's actually critical for our teenagers. It's an important part of the learning process. So understanding brain development and understanding the importance of treating our brains like a muscle that we're developing, the way that a Olympiad might be developing his or her physical endurance, is very similar to kinds of challenges that we want to be giving our students. And I'll take questions at the end, and we can talk about each one of these points, and I'll give you a list at the end so you can refer back to them. So my second insight is that short-term memory is limited. So each of us has a limitation to the amount of information that we can possibly process at any given time. And this is called cognitive load. For most people, cognitive load is between 5 and 9 items. So our ability to handle information at one time that's new runs between 5 to 9 new items at a time. It's one reason why telephone numbers are 7 digits long, and with the area code they're 10 digits long, because our ability to memorize or to master information and to recall it is limited by what we call cognitive load. So there's a reason why short-term memory is called short-term, because it doesn't last there. Another term for short-term memory is working memory, because that is where learning takes place. That's where our children are processing the information. I've got this little guy here who's kind of frustrated. A lot of times in our teaching situations, in our classes or in our homeschools, we can be asking kids to deal with more new information than what they are capable of handling at any given time. So one of the things I'd ask you is, how are we accommodating our kids in terms of the amount of new information that we're asking them to grapple with during the course of a day? Are we asking them to deal with complex information or new information, and we're overloading them, and that can be leading to frustration in the homeschool? So anytime your kid is resistant, anytime students seem exasperated or frustrated, we as parents and teachers, I think, have to ask ourselves, okay, wait a minute, am I asking this child to process more information than what he or she's capable at this time? Is there too much complex information here? It exceeds the cognitive capacity for short-term memory at this time, or have I just asked the kid to handle too many new items? Let's say on my PowerPoint or on this homework page, whatever you have in front of them, is there more information? Is it busy? Is there an excess amount of learning that we're asking kids to do? And maybe we can simplify the lesson or reduce the lesson or slow it down, or not rush through the material. So a lot of our resources can expect students to grapple with too much information. And if we're not accepting the limitations of our kids' short-term memory, it's really fruitless to continue just to press forward through this information because they're not learning it. If the goal is learning, then we have to make sure that we are teaching or creating a context that in such a way supports the ability that kids actually can learn. So there are many ways to define learning. One of them is learning can be defined as knowledge or skill that's stored in long-term memory. So the goal is to move some of this information from short-term memory into long-term memory. We can't move all of it back there, but why we consider information or skills that are in long-term memory learned is because we can retrieve it at any time, and we don't have to be taxing working memory. So you have your address memorized, right? You know the names of your children. You know how to drive. All the things that you can multitask. We talk about multitasking. Many of the things that we're multitasking are things that are in long-term memory, and they're not taxing or draining our working memory. But if we have too much going on when we're multitasking and we're trying to grapple with too many things in our working memory, we're going to start to drop the ball. We are going to have limitations just like our students do if we're not paying attention to the capacity that we're asking kids or ourselves to handle at any given time. So I want to prove this to you, okay? I want to show you and actually give you a bit of a handle on what your own working memory or capacity might be. So I'm going to ask you to memorize these. I think I have 9 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yes. I'm going to give you a few minutes. Memorize these 9 numbers. And I'm going to remove them in a couple of minutes. And notice I'm going to kind of chat a little bit while you're trying to memorize these numbers, just to illustrate what we often ask kids to do in a learning situation. So see if you can come up with a way to memorize those 9 numbers, and then I'll remove them and I'll give you a chance to jot them down to see what kind of working memory you have. 5 to 9 items that you can grapple with at one time. Okay, I'm going to remove them now. Jot them down. How many can you recall? Okay, here they are again. How did you do? Put it up in the chat box. Kate, let me know some of the answers you're getting there. I'm just curious if people were able to memorize 9 number.
We're struggling.
Well, and I hope basically what I'm trying to do is convince you of what we ask kids to do. I mean, I think My observation in teaching kids in a lot of different contexts is that we are asked, a lot of times we treat as character issues or weaknesses um, that kids should be able to overcome actual limitations of how our brains are designed to work. And so we're asking kids to grapple with too much information. All right, so there's many strategies for then teaching in a way that helps kids to maximize their cognitive load. There's many ways of dealing with the limitation of working memory. So I'm going to show you one right now, and I'm going to give you another set of numbers, and there's actually 10 here. I want to ask you to memorize those. No, I think there's 9, sorry. All right, how many people are going to be able to memorize those, right? I can take those away in less than a minute. And are you going to be able to recreate those numbers for me? If you recognize that they were multiples of 7, you're able to, because now you have a way of putting all of that information into one box. So let's say you have all this, you have 5 to 9 boxes in your working memory that you can be grappling with new information at any given time, because you were able to look at those 9 digits and recognize that they're multiples of 7 beginning with 7. That's all you have to know. You can now hold that in working memory, and you can start doing some other things. So one of the things that teachers are taught to do is to chunk information, and the way that you can help kids to chunk information is to teach it in such a way that they understand the relationship between the information that you're giving to kids. So you can't ask, if you're a history teacher, you can't be asking kids to just memorize a bunch of facts about and dates and the names of battles, let's say, and ask them to actually learn that information, because they don't have a way of connecting that information to other pieces, other factoids that they have. They've got to be able to have these relationships when they store this information in order for it to be in working memory, in order for it to move back into long-term memory and to be able to be retrieved. They have to see these connections. So teaching in a way that kids really can master information takes insight on our part as teachers to think about, okay, I was an English teacher. How am I going to help kids to see how various authors develop their themes in these books that we're studying in our English classes? How am I going to make these connections so that they are able to recall what we've studied about theme? Can I make it a connection to their own personal life? Can I make an analogy for them? So when I started this webinar, I told you that a lot of good teaching tips would come from the world of sports, and then that if we look at how coaches train the best athletes, that there's a lot of strategies that coaches use that we as teachers could use. That's an analogy that helps you to start kind of clumping some of these insights that I'm going to give you today together into one category, so that you create some kind of unified whole that allows you to remember what we talk about today. You're not going to be able to remember these 7 points if I don't help you make connections. And analogies, one way of doing that. Relationships such as these are all multiples of 7, help you to chunk things in short-term memory. So moving onward here. Number 3, prior knowledge accelerates learning. Prior knowledge accelerates learning. And all that means is that the more you know about a subject, the faster you'll learn new information about that subject. So one of the challenges that we have, especially with elementary students, is they don't have much prior knowledge about academic subjects that we want to teach. They don't have much, they don't come into the classroom, or we don't start homeschooling them with them having all of this experience with letters and numbers and grammar and science and history events and facts. They haven't lived long enough to really understand what we mean about history. They don't have enough life experiences. They haven't really been introduced to the abstract world of molecular science, chemistry, physics. All this is new. And so young children, have a lot of misunderstandings, and they don't have a lot of acceleration to their learning because they don't have enough background knowledge, they don't have enough experience to draw upon. Think about your own life. Maybe you like to cook, for example. Maybe you like to ski. Think of something that you know a lot about. If you're going to read an article about a topic you understand well, even if it would be fairly complex and abstract, if you have a lot of background knowledge and experience with that topic, you're gonna breeze through that article very quickly. So we need to remember this when we're working with our kids. If we're starting, French for the first time, we're going to start a foreign language. These kids haven't grown up in a bilingual home, and they haven't heard another language often besides English, let alone try to speak it. It's going to take a lot more time and patience and understanding with them at the beginning of the year and in the earlier years, and at the beginning of introducing a subject such as, let's say, algebra, because they don't have much prior knowledge to draw upon. And we need to encourage them, and we as teachers and parents shouldn't get discouraged because it's taking them so much time here at the beginning, because once they start to get prior knowledge, they'll start to pick up speed. Things will really progress, and they'll be able to learn a lot more new content later in the year, or when they're older, or after they studied this subject for a couple years. Like, so Algebra 1, kids can really struggle with Algebra 1, and then we're surprised they don't struggle with Algebra 2 or trigonometry if they've mastered Algebra 1 because they have the prior knowledge that they need. Hey, so what are we going to do if you as a teacher are teaching biology and you realize, hey, I got kids in this class that they have no clue. They seem to have no background knowledge. You're an English teacher and you realize this child doesn't really have any kind of fundamental understanding of English grammar, doesn't know how to write a sentence, and I've got kids that are willing to really move on. You've got kids of differing abilities in the class. I mean, what can we do to help these kids hang in there, catch up, support their learning? I think when we realize that prior knowledge is missing, then we've got to help them in some way. So some of the things that I did with my kids, or that I recommend, is read a children's book about the topic. All right? Read, if you're going to study physics or weather, let's say, meteorology, let's start with that. You can find a children's book that would be actually very simplistic. Children's books tend to, first of all, they have lots of pictures, and they also tend to simplify big ideas. And so one of the critical parts of the learning process in any subject is for kids to know what are the big ideas in French, in English grammar, in literature, in Algebra 1, in physics, in psychology. What are the big ideas? Well, a children's book tends to distill it down to what those big ideas are, that we as parents can then tell them, hey, this is something you need to think about. Let's talk about that. This will help you get ready for this class that you have online. It's maybe be a little bit more difficult, and it's something that we as teachers can recommend to our students. I always, I taught online 10 years before actually launching AIM Academy, and I kept adding to my website resources where kids, because I was always getting students at very different levels, and so I developed a library of resources where I could refer kids if they needed more background knowledge. I also tried to equip my students by teaching them about how they learn so that they could take some ownership in developing their own study skills and helping themselves. So watching a video can also be a quick way to get some prior knowledge. to help our kids with subjects that they're struggling with. Taking a field trip, again, can be another quick way. I mean, there's no replacement for the skill and the understanding and the speed with which we can learn when we're studying a subject that we've really devoted time to. But some of our kids are in challenging situations in the curriculum. We're working with them in school or in classes that they're taking, and you need some fast ways of getting some prior knowledge, then these are a couple of tips that you could use to support them, help them. So our next teaching tip, our next critical insight that we need to know about how kids learn is that our attention span is short. All right, so we have a limited working memory, and that's one of the differences that our kids can have, is that some kids have a larger capacity for working memory and some of us have less of a working memory. And this is the same with attention span, is some of us have a longer attention span than others, and some of us, depending on the subject, have a longer attention span. But at the end of the day, our attention span is always limited. And so we as teachers and parents need to recognize this. Okay, I'm dealing with kids who have limitations in terms of working memory. Am I overloading that? I'm dealing with kids who also have a limited attention span. Am I acknowledging that? It's actually a good thing that we have a short attention span. We are easily bored. It's something that cuts across all humanity. We are designed to seek novelty and variation. So why do you think we get easily bored? Why are we always looking for something new? Why are we always looking for something? Is our attention revived if it's presented in a new way, if there's variation? Why do we like to deviate from the routine? Well, it's good for our brains. Our brains, as I said at the beginning, develop through learning, through processing information. And so one of the ways that I believe God has designed us is so that we get bored, so that we'll keep seeking new information to process, so that our brains stay healthy, because we're constantly learning. So our brains are a learning machine, and we need to constantly be doing a steady diet of new information. And so we get bored and we go looking for new interests, and we look for something new to make us curious, to motivate us to engage in more learning. So we as teachers and parents need to realize that, okay? And I would do the same thing. I would say to my kids, hey, pay attention. You need to work harder here. Come on, try harder. You're not paying attention. And maybe sometimes it was a character issue, but I think 9 times out of 10, their brains were just acting like they're designed to act, and that I needed to up my game a little bit, that I needed to find a way to introduce some novelty or some variation. I need to mix up the routine, add some surprise to our homeschool schedule to re-engage them and to help keep their attention. All right, so we need to think about this. Number 5, motivation matters. Number 5, motivation matters. This is what I did my dissertation research in: academic motivation, kids wanting to learn, kids loving to learn. How does that happen? And I can't underscore enough how important it is for kids to be motivated. See, we can buy the best curriculum in the world, and we can design the most engaging, interesting, well-conceived lesson for our students. But if a kid doesn't choose to turn on his brain and engage in learning, he's not going to learn anything. Like, it doesn't depend on us. I mean, there are things that we can do to support student learning, but at the end of the day, we each have to take ownership for our own learning. And we are choosing, like whether you're paying attention now or not. I'm assuming you would leave the room if you weren't, but you know, I'm doing the best I can to practice what I preach and implement what I know about how I could support your learning and understanding of these tips that I want to give you here today, but you have to choose. So your child has to choose to focus his attention and for her to engage in the learning process and to activate her brain and to think about the information that's being presented and not to wander away and daydream about something else. That has to happen, okay, for learning to take place. We can't force learning upon our kids. Now, motivation can be extrinsic or intrinsic. So that means that we can externally motivate kids. We can do things and introducing novelty and surprise and modifying our approach and giving them, you know, something new, not taxing them, keeping it interesting. All of these things teachers and parents can do to externally motivate kids. We can use punishment and reward. And that has some benefit, but it's not sustainable. But at the end of the day, I mean, we can externally motivate our kids, or kids can be intrinsically motivated. And you see this, and in fact, what you probably see is that motivation is not even. Very few of us are evenly motivated just to learn anything that's put in front of us. We have individual differences. We have interests, and we have topics that captivate us and ones that don't. A lot of times it's related to the cognitive load. You know, if this is too hard for me to understand, then I'm not too motivated to try to understand it. If it's easier for me to understand, then I'm get more and more motivated to keep on trying to understand it. So there's external and internal sources of motivation. Why kids engage in learning can vary too. I mean, my teenagers got much more motivated in many subjects that had not interested them when they were younger, not necessarily because the subjects were of interest to them, but because they wanted to get into good schools and they wanted to be competitive for college scholarships. And so suddenly I saw more interest and more effort because there was a tangible goal that studying this material and getting good grades led to. So what should we do as teachers and parents when you understand that motivation has to be present in each one of your students or each one of your kids? Figure out how you're going to capture their attention and then how you're going to hold their interest. You can do that very simply by asking a question, piquing their curiosity, surprising them, and then keep them interacting with you and the content. All right. So I think you're here today because you're interested in this subject. However, I'm looking at the time because I also know I'm competing with a lot of other things that are going on in your life. So I know you're going to leave the room if I don't keep it snappy and I don't keep you engaged. So have you noticed some of the things that I have been doing to try to keep your interest? First of all, there's a lot of visuals in this PowerPoint because visuals are more interesting than words in any situation. So to look at a PowerPoint that's just filled with a lot of print doesn't hold anybody's attention. I looked for images that were kind of thought-provoking, right? Like there's an inference in this image I have here about motivation matters. You have to, you probably wonder like, what's that carrot doing hanging there? Oh, it's like, you know, try to motivate the kid with a carrot, not a stick. I mean, there was all these connections that you had to make, and that occupied you and made you look at my screen for a while. So I'm kind of, that's what I'm thinking about as I'm creating this lesson here. I'm asking you questions. I'm trying to keep you engaged. I gave you a little test where I made you see if you could memorize those numbers. I realized that I have to keep that there's a responsibility and a role that I have to play in terms of helping you learn this material. I mean, but at the end of the day, the power's in your hands. If you don't find it relevant or applicable, you're going to leave the room. And there's nothing I can really do about it as a teacher or a parent except reflect on, okay, wait, what else could I have done? So we're going to have questions at the end as another way of giving you an opportunity to be able to personalize and individualize your experience today, which is another tip that I'm not going to get to today. So if our students are not motivated, we're wasting our time. So I'm going to challenge us as teachers and parents to really stop and think about the kid who's not motivated in my class or not motivated in homeschooling, either across the board or in this subject area, and realize that, okay, that's a problem we want to try to solve. What can we do because this kid is not learning? And there's such a reward in helping kids figure out that this material, this content is worth knowing. What can I possibly do? So the ultimate goal is intrinsic motivation for whatever reason. I mean, you know, what we're trying to develop in our kids and in our students is a love for learning's sake. And we just want to be a part of the process. Our brains are innately hardwired to learn all the time. So a love for learning is supposed to be a natural human condition. So it's not that hard to achieve this end. In fact, I think a lot of reasons why kids don't love to learn is because of the kind of learning context we've asked them to learn in historically. So I think kids, this is another summary, kids are born loving to learn. And we as homeschool parents and teachers need to shepherd that. We need to guard that. We need to protect that love for learning and keep dwelling with our children and understanding ways so that we keep that love for learning alive. So which I appreciate your attendance here today, because I think these tips will help us keep that love for learning alive. Now, intrinsic motivation, it just may not appear overnight, and it may not even appear during your homeschooling years. There's a lot going on with adolescence that can mask a love for learning. There's a lot of boredom, there's a lot of lack of motivation that can be going on with our adolescents, in particular because they are going through adolescence. You know, puberty is just this huge dramatic event that's taking place in their lives, and so your academic goals for them are not necessarily at the top of their list of things that they should attend to. We don't want to give up on them. We want to keep creating this supportive learning environment, and that intrinsic motivation may very well be there growing underneath. It just may not be very evident until they're on the other side of their full cognitive and psychological development that's taking place. So, number 6, multisensory experience multiplies learning. Okay, there's a reason we have 5 senses. Each one of our senses has a limited amount of information that it can process at any given time. So if we're asking our kids to learn about something solely by reading about it, reading print, their cognitive capacity for how much knowledge they can process is limited by just how much they can process visually. So if you start to add sound, we've now kind of duplicated the amount of information that can be processed through print and what they're hearing. And if we add a tactile experience where they can actually touch and feel what they're learning about, have a hands-on experience, we're now really multiplying how much information they can process. So the best kind of learning, what you know the best, what you remember most are your experiential learning. Is any experience you've had, you're going to remember better than anything you read. Now, we obviously can't make everything that we need our kids to know. I mean, they're growing up in a very complex world. It's necessary for them to learn about a lot of things that they can't directly experience, but we at least need to recognize the power of experiential learning and realize that in homeschooling, kids have a lot more opportunity for experiential learning. I mean, this is what I think is one of the greatest deterrents of a conventional setting is we decontextualized learning and we take kids out of the real world and we put them inside, a classroom and limit them to sitting in a desk for 7 hours confined to these 4 walls, and then we try to teach them about the real world instead of allowing them to be out in the real world. With homeschooling, we can actually go out and have more real world experiences. I like to give the example of, if I read a book about Africa, I can learn some things about Africa. If I watch a video about Africa, I'm going to learn a lot more about Africa. If I go to Africa, I'm going to it's not even comparable what I now know and have learned about Africa from going there that a video or a book could just never duplicate. So how can you bring more of a multisensory experience into your classroom, into your program, into your homeschool projects, field trips, group work, putting on plays, doing science experiments, simulating real life wherever you can, and realizing you have to slow down the curriculum to do this. If you just make kids read things, yes, it'll look like they're getting through more stuff. But what you need to know is that they're not learning more stuff. They're going to learn more stuff if you slow down what you have less that you're asking them to master, but you're giving the opportunity to learn it in a multi-sensory way and to practice you with it. It's why sports is such a powerful metaphor for learning. It's why we can take kids and they can become the best athlete they're capable of while they're growing up because they get to actually experience sports. They don't learn about what professional baseball players do. They get to actually do the same stuff that professional baseball players do. We just kind of shrink the playing field and we modify the rules, but they're essentially playing the same game. Okay, the last one, positive emotions enhance memory. Okay, I tried to be alliterative in my 7 tips to actually help you. Remember, we'll see when I list the 7 tips at the end if that does make a difference, but you can remember more when you are happy than you can remember when you are sad or anxious or stressed or fearful. So when you're having a negative, now think about this, were you ever in a learning situation where the teacher didn't like you or other kids didn't like you? Maybe you're being bullied. I mean, this is why I think so many parents are reporting coming into homeschooling because their kids being bullied in school. Just think about how that would reduce your ability to pay attention and attend to what the teacher or your parents asking you to do. I mean, whenever we feel threatened, we get what's called tunnel vision, like all of our resources, all of our cognitive abilities, all of our physical abilities and psychological defenses all get focused on protecting ourselves. So we are not able to learn anything new when we're under threat. But when we're laughing, we're having a good time, for some reason, this just opens us up to new experiences because we're completely open. We're relaxed. We don't feel threatened. There isn't anything else competing for our attention. So it's not necessary that we have to be humorous teachers. I tried to be witty and I tried to use humor in my classroom. But that's just one strategy. The key thing that we as parents and teachers bring to a learning environment is warmth and encouragement, affection, acceptance. I mean, it's unfortunate that nowadays, teachers in a conventional setting have to be really careful about touching students. because touch is really important for affirming one another and expressing affection and support and acceptance. But we as homeschool parents, we can do this all the time. We can create this very warm, supportive, encouraging, accepting environment, and that's something we want to preserve, because kids are going to be able to learn more and remember more of what happens in a context where they're feeling happy and they're having a good time. So, I mean, my homeschool had its days of unhappiness and stress and arguments and conflict, and I'm sure yours does too. What are we gonna do when that happens? Well, just recognize, okay, wait a minute, I gotta stop, and I can't make everybody sit down and do their math while we're all angry at each other. We've got to resolve this conflict because nobody's learning any math right now. And so we have to reset the environment. Okay, let's work through what just happened so we can actually get back to learning. And if all else fails, you throw up some pictures of puppies and kitties. That's how I would. If you're teaching a really tough subject like calculus, then I would say I have no idea how I would teach calculus, but I would definitely have lots of puppies and kitties on my PowerPoint presentation, so at least kids would be charmed while I was explaining all these abstract formulas to them. So those are my 7 tips for today, and I'm love to get some reaction and have some questions and your thoughts. And I think, Kate, you're going to take it from here, right?
Yeah, sure. So folks can send questions into the chat box. I have a few jotted down already, but if you send them into the chat box, and then I can just ask them directly.
Or if people want to make comments, they can turn on their mics too.
Yeah, you have the ability, I think, next to your name to unmute yourself too. One question regarding the brain workout, and you talked about periods of rest. Any thoughts on how to structure like the homeschool day based on that?
That's a good idea, or that's a good comment, Kate. Yeah, I think you should probably do hard things first thing in the morning when kids are well rested, because it probably do you ever notice that kids are pretty exhausted after lunch? I think recess, letting them relax, and they don't have to necessarily go to sleep, but if they can have a cognitive break and do something that they find refreshing or replenishing, would be a good idea. And it's important for kids to know they can't cram for tests and that they're not going to be able to perform as well if they're tired. So making sure that kids get plenty of sleep, which I think homeschooling facilitates. I think a lot of kids in a conventional setting are sleep deprived.
Yeah.
Did you have some ideas, Katie?
No, I think that was that's very helpful. Yeah, I definitely talk about the not cramming with my math students because you need a break from it to process the material. I just got another question I think is a good one, if that's all right. This mom is looking for specific tips on how to motivate a 6th and 8th grader who profess to not like any subject. They would rather have time to do all their creative projects rather than anything else.
Yes, and their ages are interesting. So when kids are in early adolescence, that's where you're going to find the most difficulty with motivation. So here's what's happening with these kids, early adolescence. They are having the same kind of cognitive growth spurt that they had from 0 to 2 years of age. It's just really remarkable. And early adolescence is a lot more disruptive and dramatic than later adolescence might be. So that you're getting a lot of pushback from middle schooler age kids is not surprising. And so it's good that they actually have projects they're interested in. So thank God for that, because some early adolescents are interested in zero. And if they're good things, if they're good interests, encourage that. Let them just go for it as much as possible. Support that as much as possible, because you're going to get time back when they're older, than their later teens, for some of these subjects. Can you reduce the cognitive load at all? Let's say, I don't know if she's chatting with you, Katie, in any way, but let's say that they find both math and science difficult. I mean, can you rotate the subjects? I mean, you're not going to agree with this, Kate, because math should be done every day. Is there a way to maybe do science on Tuesday and Thursday, and or rotate when you do math and science, so that you do one in the morning one day and the other in the morning the next day, to sort of alleviate some of the cognitive load that the kids are having to grapple with? I would sit down with my kids. I would sit down with my adolescents. I say, okay, here's what's going on. You're having this phenomenal event take place. It is so exciting. You're becoming an adult, and your brain is changing, and so that's a part of why you're not that interested in everything that you should be, and why your emotions are more unpredictable. So here are some of the things that you can do to help yourself get through this period academically, because we can't just take 2 years off of school and wait for this to be over. So bring them into the party, bring them into the process, and ask them what they think would be good tips. Kids having ownership is a real good source of motivation. If it's their idea and you give it a try, whatever their suggestion is, they'll put more effort into seeing their suggestion succeed.
Yeah, I think that's excellent, because I think it forces that ownership. If they help come up with the solution, or they agree to, okay, we need to do this subject 3 times a week, then they're being held to their own choice.
Yep.
So I'm reading a couple of these. If you have an art-focused child, would it help to incorporate more projects into non-art subjects? That one's from Amy Wallace, actually.
Oh yes, yes. And I think let's say the child isn't very good at math, or they resist math. I mean, Kate, wouldn't you agree that there's a lot of good ideas out there for art projects that are actually mathematical in nature? What I did with the U kids with math, you became a math teacher, so you were not the math challenged child, but other ones who will remain unnamed we did a lot of games. We did a lot of card games, a lot of number games, a lot of strategy games. Was my way of sort of getting some math, developing math skills in a way that kids didn't really recognize that was going on. Yeah, I think the whole idea, Amy, of working with a child through their interests, wherever you have motivation, think about, okay, how can I use motivation? Like, so my sons really love sports. And so I let them write about sports. I let them research sports, learned about the science of sports, did health and nutrition. Math was, baseball, statistics. And I try to leverage where I had motivation any way I could, because I understood that motivation had to be present for learning to take place.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think you find what they love and you work with it. And there are a lot of connections. I was actually just going to show, I just worked on this. This is a math project where the graphing leads to like this cool design. It's a stained glass project. I was working on that last night, and it's fun because if you do the slopes correctly and the y-intercepts and all those things that are pretty detailed in Algebra 1, you get something that's symmetrical and looks good. So it kind of motivates you in a different way.
Yeah, well, Katie, you quilted, and I don't know what predated your interest in quilting or math. I always thought you got interested in math because you liked patterns, and quilting, you were always intrigued by math, but let's say a kid wasn't intrigued by math, quilting as an example would be a good way for kids to practice their math, because there's a lot of measurement. Sewing would be a good way to engage them.
Yeah. I have another question here that kind of goes in a different direction. Kristen started homeschooling kindergarten in the fall. They chose a fairly difficult curriculum and their child is getting it, but it's been a struggle. She wonders what you recommend for a first grade curriculum. Should they continue to advance or take it back and not be so aggressive next year?
Yeah, first grade outside, books at the library. Yeah, one of the downsides of homeschooling becoming such an established trend is there is just so much curriculum available for you, and I think early childhood, primary grades, kids need to be outside. They need to be experiencing the world. They need to be on field trips. They need to be having fun. They need to be going to the library. They need to be read to and reading books. They don't have the fine motor skills. I don't know if you have a curriculum that has a lot of writing and printing required of children. And when we were classroom teachers, which Katie was and I was, we just had to have kids fill out these worksheets because we got them confined in these four walls and we got to keep them in their seats, and you couldn't take them outside. So, but they don't have the fine motor skills to really fill out that stuff, and so all the attention that they have is devoted to this, what is really kind of an arduous workout of filling out these blanks, because it's very difficult for them to print, or some of you are probably making them do cursive. All of their attention gets sucked up into the handwriting. So, and I let my kids dictate to me, tell me the answers till they were like 9 or 10 years of age. So if you like the curriculum, and you find it motivating for you, maybe you could actually just have her tell you the answers if that helps. Modifying resources, like, let the resources you're using be a tool. Don't be enslaved by them, and modify what you're doing so that you are honoring how kids develop cognitively. Like, I think my main message is like, look, this is the way the brain works. We accept how the heart works. Let's not try to make our kids' brains work differently than they're designed to work. Let's modify our learning environment, our expectations, and our teaching strategies to respect how their brains are designed to work.
That's great. You had said, when you talked about attention span, you said attention span is short, and you said we can all kind of vary. Can you develop attention span in kids? I guess I was just thinking, like,
Yep.
In math especially, like there's a skill of being able to stick with it, and just what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we pay attention to what we're interested in. So you can't really develop attention, you have to develop interest. And interest is developed, first of all, this is why rigor is good, because if we work hard at something and then we actually succeed, we get more interested in it because we get that positive reinforcement. So you want to make sure that your kids are not experiencing a lot of failure and frustration. But so focus on interest. How can I get my kid more interested in this subject? And you'll find they start paying more attention to it. There is interesting research coming out, and Bonnie, our resident psychologist, she's probably read about it. I mean, our attention span seems to be reduced by all the technology that we're surrounded with. That it is almost, I think some interesting research is, the theory is it's cognitive overload. I mean, we're just overstimulated. And we're not overstimulated by the natural world. Like, I honestly think the natural world and nature is where we're supposed to, our brains, the natural world fits our brains like a glove. It's what I like to say. Like, we're supposed to be out in it. And in fact, there's research that oxygen, getting out in fresh air, will improve your cognitive capacity significantly. So I think you have to figure out how you can get kids interested in these things where they can have a longer term attention span, but then also you need to probably decrease and limit the amount of technology and visual stimulation. And Kate, I know you're doing this, as probably most young moms are, right? You know, you limit how, you don't have a TV, right?
No,
Last I knew. I
we
mean,
do not have a TV, but
which
if
is
the
why,
Eagles go to the Super Bowl, we might cave.
well, and it's why your children love to come to my house, because we have big TVs here, but we limit it, right? I mean, we didn't have a TV till you kids were older. And that's probably pretty hard for parents these days, but I'm sure most parents realize they should be limiting how much kids have access to that.